Okay, I think then let's get started. I'm sure there's going to be some more people who will be joining, but a huge welcome to everyone to the Alan Turing AI and Arts group, and today we'll be having a webinar which I'm going to introduce properly in a moment. And before doing so, I just wanted to say a very warm welcome to all our existing members of the AI and Arts group. And for those of you who are not necessarily members of the group, you are definitely encouraged to sign up. And I'm just going to put the link in the chat there actually to the landing page for the group, where if you might have to scroll down quite far, but that's where you can also join. I'm Sunil Manghani, and I'm one of the organisers of the group, along with my colleagues Andre, Lile, Sameli, and Flora and Lucas. And Lile Demerzi is also here co-convening this event with me. Welcome from us both. The group's been going, I think, about 5 years, and we're mindful that the membership has really been growing significantly of late. So today's webinar is the start of a new series of events, including some hybrid seminars. So the link in the chat there for the next event on the 10th, there will be some places, a little bit limited due to capacity, but if you are in London, you're very welcome to also attend that. As I'm sure you're aware, but just in case you're not, the Alan Turing Institute is the UK's National Institute for Data Science and Artificial Intelligence. The offices are situated inside the British Library complex, which is just across from King's Cross. There are many interest groups at the Turing, but I think the AI and Arts group is unique for its situating of critical questioning within the arts. So we have a very diverse membership and a growing membership, as I mentioned. Perhaps an underlying shared interest for all is a kind of question around how AI can be thought to sort of augment and also be enriched by the arts, as well as how data science and the arts can help each other to ask each other's kind of questions, but I think also increasingly to kind of collaboratively formulate the critical questions and methods of the day. There are a number of ways for you to get involved. One of the key ways is to contribute to the group's online blog or for the AI and Arts forum. And again, I'll just put a link there in the chat to the forum. This platform, it's based on Medium, as some of you may be familiar with. So you can create a login with Medium, and then that allows you to submit stories to the forum. So we aim there to share new insights, project updates, and explorations at the intersection of AI and arts. Please do, have a look at it, get a feel for types of materials that we've published. And we really do encourage, future submissions from all of you. And there is a tab there for submit, which will give some instructions for the process. Also encourage those of you who are members of the group, you will have access to the Slack channel, which you're certainly very much encouraged to use to share news, ideas, to try and connect with each other and so forth. We are really mindful that we've had a bit of a lull in events, such as today's events. So this is the first of a series where we'll be aiming to help us all kind of get together more to share thoughts and projects and so forth. So please do keep an eye out, and not least on the Slack channel, for forthcoming events. So just a very quick comment for the next event, which is mentioned in the chat on the 10th. This will be a hybrid event where the idea is to be looking at an article that was published by Johanna Walker, who's based at King's College, and it's a collaboratively written paper. And so the idea is that we can share a reading of the paper, and there's instructions for doing this when you sign up to the event, and I think the link's there in the chat. as I said, if you are available in London, you want to come and be in the room for that meeting, it'll be fantastic. But it is hybrid, and and I'm going to be using a tool called Perusal, which is I found quite a nice tool for asynchronously sharing, reading, and commenting on texts to then help facilitate discussion. Right. So that's just some preamble to remind you all of different ways to get involved and to hopefully have welcomed you to the group. I'm really we'll turn now to today's event, and I'm really deeply grateful to Dave Murray Rust, who will be speaking to us. It was originally, I think, billed as speculative and critical design practices for engaging with AI, and I think I've noticed, Dave, from your slides today, it's tweaked to relational AI interaction design, if I spotted that correctly. Dave Murray Rust is Associate Professor in Human Algorithm Interaction Design at the Faculty of Industrial Design Engineering at TU Delft. He explores what he describes as the messy terrain between people, data, algorithms, and things through a combination of making and thinking to build better futures for humans and AI. And he also holds an honorary fellowship with the University of Edinburgh. And there's much more I could say, but I want to let Dave crack on and tell us about his work. So he's going to showcase how design approaches can be used to inform the creation of AI technology with the hope of creating more resonant and humane technologies. So I'm delighted to introduce Dave. He'll talk for about sort of 40 minutes, and then we have opportunity for questions. I would suggest that as Dave is talking today, feel free to drop questions and thoughts into the chat while he's talking. I won't interrupt him, but it's just sometimes certain things come to mind at certain points. So feel free to just drop those in the chat. I'll keep an eye on those, and then we can kind of collate them at the sort of Q&A sort of type time. So with no further ado, I think Dave, a huge welcome from the group. Thank you so much for being here, and we're thoroughly looking forward to hearing you speak.
Lovely. Thanks, Sunil, and thanks very much for having me. I'm going to do the traditional thing of going, right, can I share my screen and can you see it? So here's sharing it, and here is some
Absolutely, we
slides.
can see it. Yeah,
Hopefully
perfect.
you're just seeing slides and nothing else. Wonderful. So yes, I changed the title. Everything is in flux. We're constantly redesigning everything and trying to find new stories to tell for things. But broadly, this is about where some creative, speculative, critical design practices meet up with AI and how this might help us to make better stuff in one way or another. I've got too many slides. There's too many things I want to talk about, so I'll be a bit quick at points. But I think it should be okay. So a little bit about me. I have a background in AI and also AI and music. That was my PhD many years ago. And I moved from that into human-computer interaction, mostly through the lens of social machines and looking at how online interaction unfolds. And now I've been gradually making the transition into design through the Institute of Design Informatics in Edinburgh and now industrial design engineering in TU Delft. And I tend to be interested in speculative and relational design, but also very much in prototyping and making stuff, because I think this is part of how I like to think. And in order to make all of that feel alive, I try and keep up an arts and music practice as well. I won't be talking much about that, I'm afraid, but it's there in the background for things. I'm part of the Decode project. There's a URL in the top right. This is a big Marie Curie ITN, which is a collection of PhD students who are currently rethinking what it means to be doing design in a world where everything is technological and intelligent and mutable and shifting. So there's lots of interesting stuff coming out of that project, and we have a big event in October where you'll be able to see the final outcomes. I'm also co-director of the AI Futures Lab, where we're looking at how we can bring ideals of rights and justice into the design of AI systems, originally centered around the future of work, a bit more broadly now, but how can we help design systems that are just in various situations? In this talk, though, I've called it Relational AI Interaction Design. There's three concepts that I build on here a bit. One is relationality, one is the idea of experiences, even if that's spelt wrong on the slide, And the last one I'll just touch on is the idea of speculative design. So once I've done that, I'll go through a bit of a framing of the whole concept, some small examples, and then if I can get through them, there's 4 projects that I want to share with you in this space. So relationality is one of those funny words. We're used to it in databases where we talk about relational databases. And at its root, to me, it's the idea that it's not the things, it's the relations between them. So it's not about the humans or the technology, it's about the way that they relate. And in some ways, that's very simple. In other ways, it goes very deep into philosophy about where these things come from. But if we're talking about it, we can also think about what the relations are. So common ones that people pick up are power. Who has power in particular situations? We can also ask about ownership or visibility or responsibility or companionship. So there's a whole range of different relations that play out between humans, but also between humans and stuff. Some related concepts, I'm really interested in agency, and this is how do things, people, and algorithms affect and shape the world around them. This is not quite the same as the AI agents that are famous at the moment. It's a much more general concept because many things shape the way that we behave, from the chairs that tell us how to sit, the roads that shape the way that we encounter the world through our cars. So a lot of very material things have various kinds of agencies. And when you have lots of things together, there are interagencies between them, and we have chains of effects and things co-shape each other. This is a bit related to the idea of entanglement. So lots of bits of the world are codependent on other bits of the world. And as humans, we're codependent on all sorts of systems that keep us alive in various ways that we're also part of shaping. And entanglement is really about looking beyond the immediate things and looking at the networks of dependencies that constrain and shape the human condition. So I talk about algorithms and humans, but really we can go a bit more broad and we can think about the data that goes into those algorithms, the practices of machine learning research that gives rise to them, the way that systems are commissioned and deployed, the power that sits behind that. And we can even go more broadly into the materiality of the computation, the environmental impacts that it has, the theories that shape the way it's developed, and the social imaginaries that shape the things that we decide to make and the way that we structure things. This all gets a bit abstract. Let's get a bit more concrete. This is some work from quite a few years ago, saying, right, we have phones, we have devices. They present to us as being quite neutral. In the background, they're sending all of our data to shady organizations that want to make money off us and advertise to us in various ways. What if we change that relationship? What if I say, okay, I want my phone to lie on my behalf? So this is what we call pro-social deception. It's lying, but for what I would call a good cause. So if I'm sitting in the Red Lion pub, I might ask my phone to send location data as if I was in the vegan cafe next door, so that my health insurer thinks that I'm living my best life and I'm doing my asanas, not that I'm sitting there having a pint. I might get it to be vague on my behalf and say, well, I'm somewhere in Kettering, or I might do something like ask it to simulate what I normally do if I've decided I want to do something else today. Or we could look at a calendar that fills itself up with fake but plausible meetings so that people can't book you, but you look busy. So these are kind of examples of deceptive relations that we might pick up and play with. Another relation that we've been looking at recently is respect. This is often a very human thing. It's something that we perform in various ways in social situations. But now, because technology is part of our communication, it gets into that performance and it gets into the ways that we do things. So if we take a situation like Smart Compose that looks at what we're about to write and tries to fill it in and guess for us, it respects my time. So it's kind of respecting and being deferential and supporting me in doing things quickly, but it's giving me a canned choice, which somewhat undermines my autonomy and it's not respecting my agency. At the same time, it supports a quick response, so that's a good respecting of social rules. But also it's framing making a reply as a burden, not as a situated response to an actual person. So it's reducing kind of the respect that I'm showing to someone else. So by picking up these relations and looking at them, we can get some quite nice detailed pictures of what's going on between people and technology. So that's relationality in this situation. Experiential stuff, in some ways, it doesn't need much explaining. Creating stuff that is tangible and playable with and explorable is always powerful, especially if you can get small people wearing leopard suits to play with it. And it might mean things like making data physical. So connecting IoT data to, in this case, these are Viz blocks. You can connect them to IoT data streams. And it means when someone puts the hire bike back, the feather wiggles, or the glove flaps, and people can bring their own materiality to this, and they can see it as a fight of shared meaning making because they can attach their own stuff to it to interpret data in ways that they want. Getting a bit more AI-ish, this is Mark Williams' graduation project from a few years back. He made a smart fabric chair cushion. When you sit on it, it projects this pattern of dots next to it, which is your bum print. And it's wonderful seeing people sit on it because you have this initial reaction of squeamishness and discomfort when you realize that these circles, that's your bum and people are looking at your bum because we don't normally share that. But then you start asking, okay, whose chair is it? Where does the data go? And you start wondering what we can infer from this data. And if you ask someone a difficult question in an interview, do you see the moment where they clench up and can you read that out of their bum print? So making stuff experiential is a good way to engage people. This is a very maximalist approach to understanding blockchains. It's an annotated portfolio of, I think this is, 15 different ways that we can make various parts of this abstract infrastructure something physical, something tangible, something the public can engage with. So I'm a big fan of using experience to bring things out. This is a much more targeted one. This is called the Personal Press. It's a student project from last year. You have two knobs. One of them chooses a writing style. One of them chooses a political leaning. And when you twiddle them, a language model rewrites the same news article according to those framings. So in some ways it's very simple, but it really articulates this idea of bias and positionality that we all talk about, but until you've really sat and made your own article that way, you don't feel it in quite the same way. Going back a little bit, this is Jake Elwes' piece from 2019. If you don't know the experiential AI group, I'm guessing a lot of you are familiar with them because they're entangled with the Turing nowadays. But it's work that we supported early on. Jake was training GANs back when GANs were exciting, right? This wasn't so long ago. This was 4 years back, and the idea that you could make these high resolution morphing images was incredible. But Jake was training them on London drag performers. So you get these wonderfully in-between identities with the strong cheekbones and then the full lips and the mascara. And it's just such a nice articulation of the possibilities of gender and machines, and having it looking fabulous like this, I feel captures people much more than a lot of the discussion. The final pillar was speculative design. I'm not going to go deep into this, but the important bit is that where we often think of design as making better stuff, there's a whole other thread of design that aims to open up new perspectives on wicked problems, to create spaces for discussion and debate about alternative ways of being, and to encourage imagination. So when I'm talking about design here, I'm not trying to make shinier things. I'm trying to make things that make us think about the world in various ways. So with all of that, now we can talk a bit about relational AI interaction design. It starts a bit from AI gives us so many what I would call affordances for building interactions. This is a classification from Nur Yildirim and a few others. They can estimate and forecast and compare. We're quite used to these. We see them in weather forecasts. We see the ranking in recommendation algorithms. Designers have been making use of detection and identification to come up with new kinds of interaction. If you can detect something with a camera and respond to it, if you can hear a word and do something in response to that, it gives you a new way of interacting. There's a bit around discovering patterns. And now, of course, we're seeing a lot around the ability of systems to generate new things. I'm not going to get into the newness, but to generate stuff and to act at least somewhat on their own. And we also have approaches to designing better AI systems. So we can look at the way human values come into algorithmic systems and they shape them in different ways. We can look at ways people can contest decisions that AI systems make. We can look at how people perceive the fairness or otherwise of AI systems and the values that they ascribe to that. For me, I think there's at least 3 levels to look at these things on. 3 is always a nice number, right? At a low level, we've got the interactional affordances. So how can we bring AI stuff into designing things? And at a wide scale, we've got the implications of AI. So what do these systems do at scale for different groups of people? Are they fair? Are they just? How do they affect us at a social level? In the middle somewhere, there's what I call AI relationality, and this is the relations between people and AI systems, where we're interested in questions of agency, the ways people that understand systems, what happens when these things start mediating our sociality or changing the way that we work. We're interested in how things unfold over time and the attachments we form, or the way that it shapes our thinking, our processes, our engagement. And it's this middle level that I tend to be most excited about. So a few examples in this space. This is a bit more towards the interactional affordances, but this, although it looks like duct tape in the backpack, it's actually a machine vision camera in a necklace that can detect smiles. When it detects a smile, a heat pack on the back of the neck warms up, and this allows blind people to engage in flirting. So it's really nice. It's a fun project. It just about works. It looks wonderfully hacky. There's wires all over the place, but it does just about work well enough to get the effect. It's amazing that a bunch of design students with no prior coding experience could make this a couple of years ago. The stuff they're doing now is amazing because ChatGPT takes away the fear of coding. So it's really nice that we can build stuff like this. And of course, it makes us think about what the relations are and how they're mediated by the technology, because it has to choose what is a smile and what isn't. And that shapes the way that you socialize. This is a project from a couple of years back where we made these smart lock boxes. They're connected to smart contracts and blockchains. When they're in the right place at the right time with the right person, then they open up. And you can use that to build secure delivery systems. So this is sort of intelligent technology-ish. But to understand them a bit better, we hired some bike couriers and we asked them to do some slightly scripted deliveries with these things as if they were real deliveries. And you fairly quickly find that the humans really don't want the system to tell them where to go or how to go there, because they see their value as people who know the city and know their way around it. Really different with bike couriers and, say, Deliveroo drivers, who often don't have the same kind of experience and identity. And they also really value their social interactions that allow them to improvise when things go wrong, when the person they're trying to deliver to is not there. It gives them something that they can hand over. But they love it when the system says, you don't have to worry about this box anymore. So when the system takes over responsibility, the package. So that's a relation that they really like a clear boundary on. So by making these things, putting them in the world with people, we understand what's important to them. We're going into space now. This is robots for exploring Mars. Feels like a very different context, but some of the questions are the same. This is Roland Justin. It's a slightly cognitive robot that they're planning to use for exploring the Martian surface. It has a chunk of AI in it, so it can recognize things, it can do a bit of pathfinding and a bit of planning so that it can manipulate things. When you're controlling it, you're probably in orbit around Mars, which means there's about a 30-second delay to the surface, and there's about an 8-minute delay back to Earth if you have to ask questions of the team there. So it's a slightly weird situation. And to make that even worse, while the robot is in some ways really clever, it has some very odd and confusing limits to its intelligence. And it's also, until this point, been very bad at saying what's wrong. So it will sit there and do nothing observable for 10 minutes and then just say error, when actually all that needed to happen was you had to tell it to go around the back of things so that it could reach the thing that it was going for. Humans in this situation tend to want to take over control, and they want to grab the joystick and drive the robot around. But that's a really bad thing to do when you have these long communication delays. So this project was all about using game design elements to indicate what's happening with the robot, to shift that boundary of agency, to stop people wanting to control it, but to move them towards wanting to support it in doing what it's doing and assist with its planning, but let the robot have the right kinds of agency about what it's doing. So they were 4 little examples. Now I'm going to go into some slightly larger projects. The first one this is called Grasping AI. This is a set of experiential exercises that we created. By the way, I'm putting these papers here not as a brag, but because it's the best way to make it really clear this is collaborative work, and to make sure that I show everyone's names rather than having to say them all out loud, because everything I do is collaborative. It's the only way that I enjoy working. So we took this set of layers of AI interaction design, and we also looked at a bit of a spectrum between using it to make better technology or critiquing the technology that we have. We made this design space and situated a few methods in it. We've got, I think it's 8 of them, it might be 9, but 8 fit well on the slide. And each of these is designed to be something we can give, in this case, to students. It could also be to engineers, to companies, all sorts of people. And they can carry them out in 40 minutes to 2 hours without a huge amount of support. And it helps them think into some qualities of the AI system that might not have been otherwise apparent. So for instance, be the machine learning just asks people to try and do the task that they're asking the technology to do. And although that sounds kind of simple, and in a lot of ways it doesn't work because we work in different ways to the technology, it does help to build up a kind of machine viewpoint of what's going on. And it really helps to understand the difficulty of some of the tasks that we want these things to do. Uncertain interactions asks people to take their traditional flowchart of if this, then that, and replace every junction with a spectrum of possibilities. So rather than it being yes or no, it might be 20% yes and 30% no and 40% hamburger. And this helps people think into, okay, what happens when interactions become probabilistic? How do we manage that uncertainty? How do we retrain our thinking to not be so binary and delineated? For data sets is actually surprisingly practical. You take a machine learning model that you've trained that works reasonably well, and then you go and delete half your data set and retrain it. And you keep doing that until it starts doing something weird and uncomfortable. And this helps you firstly notice the boundaries of where it works and where it doesn't, and get a feel for what happens when it gets wrong. But it also helps you think into what happens when bits of the training data are not there, or when they don't represent all of the system, all of the examples that they should be doing. So it helps you understand what a biased or non-representative data set actually feels like in practice. Metaphor shifts, we'll come back to metaphors in a bit more depth soon, but this works on the idea that people have more or less explicit metaphors about what they're doing, and changing them can be really useful. So if I see students working with things, I really often draw on AI as a pet in one way or another, and pets have a particular set of relations to people. If you change that metaphor, you get different things out, and you can change it to other similar things, but you can also go quite strange. What happens if instead it's a ghost or a forest or kombucha? And some of the weirder metaphors give you some quite nice ideas about how you might shape the technology to do slightly different things and different understandings of what it is doing in the first place. And we gave these to students and we asked them about what was going on. And we find that this kind of work helps them with this relational level. They start asking questions about the deeper relationships that people form with things. You know, what happens when you have an attachment to something that has become companion-like? You have a sense of identity, but then the technology dies or you have to give it back because it served its purpose. A lot of thinking about how the agency of technology can affect people. So stuff starting to do things on its own can be extremely creepy. There was a group that was making a car seat that would detect when you were feeling sad and it would kind of hug you mechanically. And while in some ways that's a nice idea, if it does it when you're not expecting it, it's horrifically creepy and very weird. So these kinds of experiential practices help us think into our relations with this technology. I'm going to throw one in that is a bit more engineering oriented because it is the Turing after all. This is what we call the human AI modeling language. And this is a system that builds on the idea. A lot of the times we think about models as doing one thing, but if we look at all of the actors around a particular model as it's deployed, you find there's a lot of people that do very different things with it. So if we take this example is a CV assessment model. Well, the developers train it, the applicants submit their CVs to it. They may or may not get some feedback and explanation. The hiring manager might have to give some scores that set up the model in various ways, and it might provide the manager with scores about the applicants. The hiring committee might look across the outcomes and decide if this is representing what they want. Human resources might want to audit. External auditors or labor organizations might also want to audit in various ways. So there's a lot of interactions that happen around each particular model. And if we take even just some of the kind of standard machine learning configurations like active learning or reinforcement learning, there's a lot of steps that happen within them. And the intent behind this work, it's a bit based in things like Feynman diagrams that try and represent interactions between particles, or this was some of the social machines work we did to try and represent online interactions in a very pen and paper way that we could still turn into systems. If we take these kinds of approaches, we can take these complex situations and break them down into communicative acts that happen between people and models that provide or request various kinds of information. And so we can formalize a lot of these different ways of interacting. We can give ideas of interfaces to use with them and ways to design those interfaces. And because we develop some consistent patterns, we can relate those to kind of positive interactions, whether it's AI design guidelines or fairness questions, all sorts of things like that. And we can do it in a way that is very pen and paper oriented. So each of these messages fits on the card. We can ask people to come in and design particular situations like this. And it means that people who don't have a lot of machine learning expertise can actually get a slightly nuanced idea of what's happening with the models. And they can start fairly quickly asking quite meaningful questions about what the system is doing or proposing ways to redesign it. So it won't turn them into AI engineers, but it works really nicely as a boundary object between the designers, the engineers, and the other stakeholders to make sure that people can understand the system in ways that lets them have a meaningful say in what's going on. This is still somewhat under development, but there should be some more work coming out on this in the next months. I promised a bit more on metaphors. I get very excited about metaphors, and so do product designers. And there's a big history of products that use metaphors in one way or another. This is the Fierophant. It's a fire extinguisher that looks a bit like an elephant, so you get the idea that water's going to come out. So there's that kind of formal way of using metaphors to show what things do. They're also often used for creativity and being generative. This is Dan Lockton's new metaphors cards. You can go to this website and you click and you'll get these pairings. How could traces of previous messages be a metaphor for confidence? And these are quite suggestive of ways that you might design systems or interactions that you might create. You can use them with people to help understand. This is more of Dan's work, people making metaphors of their mental health journey as a way to talk about what's happening for them and to materialize it and share it. They can be really useful, though, for understanding new and emerging technology. This is Graham Delft's work, saying, supposing we took a machine learning application and we cast it as a historical monster. So what if our machine learning system is Frankenstein or the pet from Little Shop of Horrors? And you get ideas about whether it has an insatiable appetite for dinner, or whether it is pulling you towards a black hole of destruction in one way or another. So metaphors help us map out the terrain of new things that are coming into the world. They're also really powerful for shaping the relations that people have. This is work where they figured out that putting different pictures next to a chatbot, they call them visual metaphors, just putting different pictures there changes the expectations people have, changes the way that they perceive exactly the same chatbot. So if they have one that looks highly trained, people expect it to be competent and they're really annoyed when it isn't. So they will read a lot into the chat just based on the picture that is next to it. Computer science, of course, is extremely metaphorical. We turn voltage levels into binary states, which is somewhat of a metaphor, at least in abstraction. The binary states, we say are data. The data we say are files or memory, programs up to interfaces. Of course, they sometimes leak, and metaphors never quite cover everything. There's a bit where they work and a bit where they work less well. And some of the metaphors really overtake their original sense. So I think if you say file to most people nowadays, they don't think of a paper file that stacks up in a filing cabinet. So that's a physical metaphor that got translated into a digital thing that now actually has its own life. Of course, if you say file to kids nowadays, they've got no idea what you're talking about because it all lives in the cloud and no one knows where their stuff is anymore. So we build a lot of metaphors as part of the work of computer science, and human-computer interaction as well is fraught with metaphors. And they're great. They help us figure things out, but sometimes we need to go back and look at the assumptions which flow from the metaphors and see how appropriate they are in particular situations. So we might ask how visible a metaphor is, because a lot of these kind of disappear. We might ask, what are the bounds? Where does it really carry across important ideas about what's happening? And where does that confuse us a little bit? We can ask what it centers, what it makes really clear, and which bits it marginalizes and hides. And around AI and data science, we see some very purposeful metaphors. So software and data carpentry, that was very purposefully saying that computational techniques are quite like the material practices of cleaning, shaping, and assembling wood and the stuff that we know how to do. So it was a metaphor of familiarity. Data is the new oil, implies a particular approach to working with data. It's a wilderness ready for claiming. It encourages kind of extractive tendencies. Cory Doctorow tried to reframe this as data is toxic waste. It's dangerous, it's long lasting, and once it's leaked, you can't put it back in the bottle. But that metaphor didn't seem to have quite as much power. Stochastic parrot was very intentionally created to critique the gap of meaning between the system and the world that it exists in. And I think we've seen that come into the vernacular very clearly. And there are some metaphors that I think are worth picking up and poking a little bit. So training and learning, I mean, it's just part of the language, right? We say it. But when we say we train the model and it learns something, it does center the idea that the models change. It doesn't necessarily give us a good sense of how they change. And it really brings associations of working with humans and animals. If you say to someone who's not a machine learning specialist, we train the model, chances are they think it's a bit like training a dog, and you give it some examples and you tell it what's right or wrong and it learns in that way. And that's really different from the process of feeding in 1 trillion tokens to adjust weights in a network. If instead you say something like fitting, that doesn't bring the same kind of conceptual baggage with it. So by shifting the metaphor, we get a slightly different sense of what's going on. Bias is another one for me. It's a technical word. It has some different associations. There are some times when we really need bias. If you're doing electronics, you make a transistor work by biasing it towards a particular point that it then operates around. If you're making a neural network, then bias is just a fundamental part of the structure. But then as a social word, it has connotations of unfairness and discrimination. It really centers the possibility that something could be unbiased. And to me, that's often a very problematic proposition, because many of the things that models might do, that people might do, there's no such thing as being unbiased. If instead of talking about removing the bias, we talk about choosing the biases, then it's much more clear that there is nothing unbiased. Black boxes started as a metaphor that gave us a sense of curiosity about how we can understand what's happening in a system where we only see the inputs and the outputs. Now the sense of the metaphor has shifted a bit, and it tends to be used a bit more to sort of throw our hands up and say we don't know what's inside it. Explanation, it doesn't necessarily feel like a metaphor, but it's casting this stuff that comes out of a model as being an explanation, and it marginalizes the idea that actually explanations are social processes, things that happen between people, and model artifacts are not the same thing. So I'm gonna, if I'm complaining, then I should come with some alternatives. I quite like the idea of casting a model as a collection of examples, and we see this a bit in the way that people are now talking about large language models and their training data set, and are they just copying what's in there? So this really centers the idea that the models are full of data. Sometimes that's literally true. If you look at support vector machines, then the support vectors are the examples that define the decision boundary. And it centers the idea that using the data is critical, but it marginalizes the way that the model works. And it means when we're thinking about designing, we think about, okay, what are the cases that we choose to build our model with? And we see some of this come through really nicely in experiential practice. So top left is Anna Ridler's Tulips Myriad, where she put a lot of work into photographing by hand a lot of tulips to then build the model out of, and she would show the photographs alongside the generative work. Or in the bottom right is Jake Elway's machine learning porn, where he took some of the pornography blocking or identifying algorithms, turned them inside out to make them generative, and it generates a lot of these images that are slightly disturbing, maybe almost erotic if you squint at them in the right way, but nothing actually recognizable. And it highlights the idea that to make a model to catch a particular kind of stuff, you need a lot of that kind of stuff to train it with, and that persists inside the model. We can talk about models as industrial compounds, and then we start wanting to know the safety data sheets for using them. This is where the idea of model cards for models and data sheets for data sets came from. It centers a kind of a pragmatic approach to managing risks and harms and the chains of responsibility. It might marginalize a bit what the models do. It might not prompt you to think about systemic ethics, like the material data sheet for lithium won't prompt you to worry about open cast mining and where the lithium comes from. But it does help us to think critically about how to build systems and the ways to hold technology to account, because it fits it into practices that we understand to some extent. Models as spaces and terrains, we can get, especially as artists, excited about the latent space of models and the way it's condensed or compressed its inputs into a smaller space in the middle, and the journeys that we can take through them. I'm going to skip through some of that. Models as fossil data. This was a really fun, playful one that came to me on Twitter. So archaeologists use the fossil record to reconstruct past histories. Models use fossil data to reconstruct past behaviors. We have all of these traces of things that have happened in the world, and this is what we build our models on. It's nice for thinking about language because it captures the difference between language in flight as a situated conversational human activity and records of language that has happened. So it's the difference between performance and understanding. We can also think of models as geofoam. But then, of course, you have to explain what geofoam is. This also came via Twitter from James Vincent. Geofoam is these giant blocks of expanded polystyrene, and they get used to create kind of landscapes, especially around constructing bridges and other kinds of artificial terrains. So they can be stacked up to create the underlying shape, and then it gets covered in soil, and at the end, it looks a bit like a normal landscape. So it captures the idea that models are extracted from the ground as fossil data, and they're used to plug gaps in the landscape, but they're not ecologically active. So again, it's getting into this gap between meaning and production. It looks like a landscape, but the stuff underneath, it's not soil. You couldn't grow things there. It doesn't connect into the ecologies at all. But it highlights that some of these things are really good for joining and filling gaps and smoothing things over and creating something that will guide people on a particular flow. So that was a bit around how metaphors are deployed and used, and some of the current conceptual metaphors around AI and some alternative metaphors. And I'm running a little bit short on time, but I think I just about have time to go through the last bit, which is all about enchantment. So this is some pretty recent work. It's coming up at Kai next month. And the impulse behind this was that people talk about AI and magic a lot. Bruce Sterling here talking about little myths and the legendary nature of AI in a fairly critical way, to be fair to Bruce. But if you look at stuff online, especially anything kind of a bit corporate, the language is everywhere. Magical AI magic tools, like it's really pervasive. And people really want to sell us this idea that this stuff is magic. And of course, that means that as a critical designer, technologist, I want to say, okay, what do we mean by magic? There's a nice paper by Campolo and Crawford about enchanted determinism. And it's the idea that, you know, as we get very excited about the mastery of the illusions that we can create with technology. But by saying it's magic, we're kind of giving up responsibility. We're not worrying so much about the consequences. We're just becoming enchanted with the possibilities. Now, enchantment's a nice word here. It is different from magic. And there's a bit of blurring that goes on, but enchantment, I think, is nice because it relates to a state of people. If I'm enchanted with a view, I'm taken out of my normal way of being, my normal functioning, and I'm just caught up in this thing that I'm enchanted with. And it has a lot of roots. We go through some of them in the paper. If an object is enchanted, then something has kind of come into it and it's given it a particular kind of special power. So it's a nice lens to look at technological works through. So to do this, we looked at a lot of student projects. This is 2 years worth of an interaction design course where students were working to some extent with AI, more or less, depending on how broad your definition of AI is. It was certainly a framing for a lot of the work that they were doing. And we said, right, sometimes they take this thing with AI in and they make it seem more magical. And it's often things like applying magical metaphors to how they talk about it. But also, as a lot of interaction designers do, applying some ideas of stage magic, the misdirection that says, look over there while you do the little things on the side, to make it feel seamless and a bit magical to an observer or to a user. But we also saw that sometimes they were doing things that would make it feel less magical, that would disenchant things, They might manifest the mechanisms behind what's going on. They might also materialize some of the beliefs and biases. So by looking at a lot of these projects, we came with this taxonomy. So we had about 3 ways that they make things more magical. We had 2.5 ways that they make things less magical, because the last one is strange, and I'll get to that at the end. So we can either design for more enchantment, or we can design for disenchantment. So magic metaphors, this is a magic lantern that builds on Harry Potter's Deluminator that absorbs light. And this was looking at energy use in hotel rooms. You can send the glow out to something, and then you can suck it back and send it into something else. But you can only use one thing at once because you're being sustainable. The one on the right, Under the Loop, it's a bit of a magic metaphor as well, right? It's got the magic spyglass that's a bit more Philip Pullman than J.K. Rowling, thankfully. But actually, there's a lot of stuff that happens behind the scenes, and it's all hidden behind a single press of the button that the user does that captures a bit of their viewpoint based on where they've chosen to point it. So it's a bit of stage magic. All the technical stuff disappears behind a single moment of interaction. Reframe Your Thought is a black pyramid that summons in a supernatural AI that will assist with your therapy. This was somewhat critical as well. Don't worry, they don't actually believe it. But it's building on the assumption that AI can understand what we need better than we can. So we should, submit to what this supernatural thing is telling us to do. The Colored Realities project that I talked about earlier, that's materializing beliefs. So this is getting into the disenchantment side of things. It's showing that the AI systems can create their own viewpoint, and it can turn really into an instrument of power. The Closer Look project, a very nice one. You have a magic mirror, and on one side you turn up and it identifies your health conditions, and it magically prescribes drugs that will help you through its machine learning cleverness. On the other side, there's a whole set of controls for someone to play the other part, where they're taking your personal data, they're negotiating with the pharmaceutical company and deciding what they should sell you for the maximum profit or power or something like that. So it's a way to manifest some of the hidden mechanisms behind the way that these systems actually function in the world. The last one, this is the future dialogue, is a set of sound activated objects where you teach your toothbrush what song you should sing to it in order to turn it on. It's a somewhat silly and playful idea, but it really encourages people to play. They get a bit of the mechanism, so they get into this sense of training the model, and they learn its limitations, so it disenchants a bit. But then once they've done that, it gives them this space where they can suspend disbelief and they can play along, and it makes it feel a bit fun and magical. And then they can go back around that circle. So the play with AI technique was kind of circular. It was phases of enchantment and disenchantment. These are all strategies, and that means that they're things that we can deploy at different times. We notice them in the world, but by articulating them, it means that we can decide consciously to draw on them. And a couple of ways that we can do it. One is to say, what if? So we can take an existing thing and we can say, what if we made it feel more enchanted by adding some extra magic metaphors, by making it look and behave as this other thing? Or what would happen if we materialized the beliefs that are behind it and make them really clear? So those are kind of things we can deploy as we're designing. Then there's another set of questions where we can say why, and this is more for critique, but we can look at things in the world and say, why does this smart thermostat use the language of magic metaphors, or why is it using stage magic to hide what's going on? And that helps to develop a bit of a critical lens. So to make some of this a bit more physical, visible, supposing we're redesigning an AI-powered room heater, if such a thing exists, we can ask, okay, what if it had supernatural capabilities? What if it, and that might mean that it could see through walls and it could turn on before you get there, and that creates that sense of magic. We could be a bit more out there and say, what if it behaves as a phoenix. Okay, what does a phoenix do? Well, they're burnt and they get reborn. So supposing it takes all of the user data that's going on, it sees that need for heat, but then it all gets erased in a magical fire every so often to preserve our privacy. And we can also say, okay, what happens if it declares its tracking mechanisms, if it makes it really clear and explains, I've turned on early because you're often home early on a Thursday. Or it could manifest the belief that AI is objective by saying, okay, we have no controls on this unit because this unit knows better than you do, and it's going to tell you when you need to be warm and when you don't. So these all give us ways that we can shape the technology that we're working with in different ways. And that brings me to the end. And I'm just going to finish with a thought about metaphors. So to some extent, metaphors are a bit like personas. Designers like personas. They're sort of summing up user research as an imaginary person. I have trouble with them. I'm never sure that they do anything very useful, but we can think of metaphors a bit as personas for relations. Any metaphor brings in a whole bundle of different relations that we might be forming with and around and through technology. So they shape the way that we think about technology. And they also change over time. So some of the most recent work we've done starts looking into what we're calling metaphorical dynamics. So as projects go on, the metaphors change. And certainly if you're developing products, the metaphors that you use with the engineers to think about what you should be designing may well be very different from the ones that you give to end users to help them understand how they should use the finished product. They're also great fun to play with. So we have a metaphor gardening manifesto. So to keep an eye on the blossoming metaphors, so to see which ones you're making use of at various scales and depending on who you're talking to. Look at the ecology of metaphors. What is it that they're doing? How do they relate to each other? See what suits the soil of your particular design. Different metaphors will work better or worse in other projects, and you can see which ones are really relating to the underlying soil of technology. You can let them be seasonal. So you bring in different metaphors at different stages to work with different people. And finally, the more wildly and boldly you experiment with metaphors, the more chance you have of finding ones that really work for what it is that you're doing. So thanks very much for listening, and I'd be very happy to talk about any of that. And I'll stop sharing so that I can see people.
So thank you so much. That was a wonderful talk. Really full of energy, and you bring so much sort of clarity to all of this, but also it remains complex as well. So it's a lovely combination. So thank you. And there's been some nice comments in the chat already. So I'll try and pick up on those. I'm mindful that we've hit up to the sort of an hour. So I do understand some people may need to go, and apologies if we can't get your questions. But just to say, this talk will be made available on the AI&Arts forum online. And I think actually a lot of those articles that you were showing, Dave, it'll be fantastic. We can maybe list those properly because those look absolutely fabulous. So I'm sure lots of people listening will want to pick up on those. I know I certainly do. I maybe just try and string together some of these comments in the chat, and if anyone has further comments they want to, if they definitely have a question they want to ask, so maybe just sort of indicate in the chat. There was a lovely question early on, actually, when you move towards the whole point about metaphor, there's been a lot of activity in the chat. So there's a very good question from Poppy, whether the word language in large language model is a metaphor. And I'll just dovetail that one with a later question that came through around just suggesting if metaphor is in a sense of common sense rules, or it's kind of interesting. So I just wonder if you want to pick up on that thing about the word language in large language model. And then I think it's sort of what you were getting to right at the end there about like whose common sense is it and whose metaphor is it, and when does it pass as a metaphor and so forth.
Yeah, great. Okay. So firstly on language, I think that's a really key point. I don't think language models are doing language in the way that people are. And there's this idea that you're trying to write a story, but it's just trying to predict the next token. It's a fundamentally different thing, but it can end up looking quite similar. I think one gets a bit philosophical about where that ends up going. And it gets a bit, Searle and Chinese rooms, and can we do language without having an understanding of the world? But to me, it does mean that we have to pay attention, I think, to different kinds of languaging. And I don't feel that the language that comes out of language models is the same as human language. And that's not a value judgment. It's more just it's a different kind of thing.
So going to Poppy's kind of, and sorry, Poppy, if you do come in if you want to speak. Yeah, if you called it large token models, which might be more accurate in one, it would change our. I think the way you're talking, this would suddenly change our relationship to these things that are available to us.
Yeah, and I mean, I say this despite the fact that they seem to be able to do some quite amazing things that end up looking and feeling a bit like reasoning and storytelling and all of those things. So I think it does slightly challenge our ideas of what happens when we do language, because we do it a lot based on the assumption that what's happening for me is similar to what's happening for everyone else. But yeah, I like large token models. That's quite fun.
And just picking back up on this point about common sense, because I think it's an interesting way of reading what you've just been saying. So metaphor, and sorry, is it Lay Marie? Feel free to come in on this, because you've got equals sign there, and I'm wondering if I'm missing something there, because I might not be literate enough on the mathematical symbols. But you then sort equals common sense rules question mark, and I wonder whether I was. Oh, sorry, yeah, Lay Marie, did you want to say something?
Oh yeah, hi, thanks for the wonderful talk. Yeah, I was wondering, there's a lot of discussions as well on common sense in the field of AI, and how to sort of, I was going to say, embody this in AI systems, with the notion that body may play a role, but this is maybe another discussion. But so the way you were going about metaphors sounded to me like a lot of discussion about common sense and how to, again, bring it to AI systems. Usually in common sense, sometimes there's a link with rules, perhaps thinking of old expert systems. And the equal sign, there was just a way to say that it's not necessarily equal, not necessarily the same notions, but they are very similar.
Yeah.
So my question was whether, do you see an overlap perhaps with the discussions in AI communities about common sense, and how close these two notions might be?
So I have to admit that's not something I've thought about. I'm thinking a bit on the fly now. Common sense is always tricky, isn't it? Because
Yes.
it's the stuff that we all assume that everyone should make sense of. To me, the bit where that slightly meets up with metaphors is that metaphors often capture common sense understandings of situations, and they may be more or less true. So one of the common sense metaphors people deploy is balancing the budget is like a household balancing its checkbook. So the government has to make the numbers add up. And I use that one specifically because it's a common sense metaphor that really doesn't work. Because the government, it's not really a household budget because they can print more of the money. And monetary theory disagrees very strongly with that metaphor. So I think for me, that's the reason to pick up and examine metaphors, is it helps us catch some of the stuff that we see as common sense reasoning that might want to be challenged.
And so, Dave, I think also one of the lines you said earlier, which I think is really important, was there's no such thing as unbiased. Basically, there's always bias, and I think that's kind of fits that. We can't any sense of common sense is going to have some sort of bias as well, and some sort of positioning, which I think leads to ideas about I'm reading your understanding of metaphors also about different kinds of literacies. But well, we don't necessarily need to go into it. Lily, do you want to come in on your question? And I know also you might need to go soon. So, and I hope you're still there, Lily. Maybe she's not. She had a question about
Yes, I'm still
oh
here.
yeah, there you
It's
are.
just my Zoom decides to not respond every time I try to unmute myself.
Oh yes, that's
My
yeah.
question was more about your creative practice, which you didn't delve that much into, but traces of it we could find it throughout the presentation, and I would love to hear more about how you are bridging that and which examples of the ones that you shared with us today reference back to your creative practice.
Yeah, I would love to talk more. One of the key ones is the musicking that I keep doing. I know you had talks recently from Owen Green around the Muse AI project. So we're part of a laptop trio, also with Jules Rawlinson. And that's been a really nice site for investigating agency, really, because we tie all of our laptops together, we deploy some algorithms that interfere in our musicking in creative ways. And it means that we start thinking about what we would like, what we want to do and what we want the algorithms to do, and how we divide up those kinds of decisions and behaviors. So the music's been very good for that. The piece I'm working on at the moment is a bit around machine listening. I've made a really unruly, I would say, synthesis system, and I'm asking it to try and learn how to play itself. So how to relate the sounds that it's making to its own parameter set. It's an interesting space because you can generate as much training data as you want. You twiddle the parameters, you make an output, and then you know those are the parameters that you made. So you make as much labeled data as you want. And to me, it's always useful to keep these things a bit practical because it gives that space for thinking about what's going on. Sorry, that was a slightly rambly answer. I can
Maybe I can just ask you a follow-up on that to help just unpack it. No, it's also kind of, I'm really mindful of the time actually. We're going to have to end soon, but it's sort of about the temporalities of this actually, because I think one of the things you've presented so well on is the need to kind of roll your sleeves up and get immersed in this stuff, to have some sort of relationship to it, and also the word at the beginning about agency was really, really, we could go on that a lot. But I kind of then am trying to pick up on, I think, Lily's question. I'm interested then in how long this sort of stuff takes, because you've shown so many wonderful looking projects, quite flirtatious kind of projects in a way that are, and on the one hand, and also picking up on the word about magic. I mean, there was a lovely line here from from Matt Jonex about see the angel, not the wire, which I thought was a lovely little phrase there. So thanks. But so on the one hand, and I appreciate in a presentation like this, we kind of get the angels and not the wires, right? But you've clearly been very, you're very clear about these are processes, these are collaborations, as also you've said. You've also picked up a bit on different skill sets about how there are certain students who are maybe doing things who didn't have experience in, say, coding, but they were able to do X, Y, Z. So I kind of just want to just pick up and just tease out a little bit more about how, I know this is too general a question because all these projects are different, but kind of like how long do some of these projects take? What's the kind of arc to how these work? And there's a certain freedom, I imagine, to sort of open up any sort of question and then to deliver on, to take it through iteratively, whatever. And then, but then some, in the end, it can end up on your slides, which, so, because I'm almost, I'd love to kind of get you to come here in a room and we to have more of a kind of practical session. But how would that work? How much preparatory work would happen, and who's needs to be in the room, and how important are you in all of this, as it were? Because like you've got a very particular set of skills and enthusiasm and a way of opening things up. And do we need people like you? Can we do this without ourselves? I don't know. Also, sorry, too many questions there, but
Yeah, that's a lot of questions. I have some answers. I think often my metaphor for processes is compost.
Okay.
You have to keep putting stuff in there and then it gets digested, and then over time you have very fertile stuff springing up. So there's another project I would have shown that was about speculating about the future of robots and in industrial contexts through artistic practice. And the key part of that happened over about 3 weeks, and it was 3 really intense weeks. But we could only make that work because there was a lot of stuff that had been bubbling along behind the scenes for a while that fed into that. So there's often a bit of slow moving background things that give rise to very rapid kind of sprints or charrettes or enactments or things towards the end. You are seeing the result of quite a few years of working here. I think the oldest one I really talked about was 2014. To be fair, most of the stuff in here was over the last 2 or 3 years.
Yeah. Yeah. And the work with students, for example, what are they managing to get these things done over, say, like a semester or how would you describe that?
Yeah, these ones are coming out of it's a course called Interactive Technology Design. They have 20 weeks. And it's based around a very rapid prototyping methodology.
Yeah.
Every week they have to show something and test it out. And so the first weeks they're really working with paper and cardboard and string. There's a lot of Wizard of Oz and role play to get the ideas before they write the stuff.
Yeah.
And then over time, gradually the technology comes more and more in.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I think the way you described some of the more analog side of things is really important, and you demonstrate it really nicely. Yeah, I just kind of the grasping AI materials you showed about B machine learning and so forth. I think incredibly inspiring, and I'm sure many people here would be thinking, yeah, maybe I could take these into my own context of working with people. And that's why I'm also interested about how much we need you kind of moment. Like you clearly are trying to you're handing over some agency and these toolkits and so forth. And I suppose it just comes back to that idea about different kinds of literacies and how we that seems to be the threshold we're on. And I might need to leave this more as a kind of comment to end on rather than for us to open it up more, because I think, Lily, we're going to have to end, aren't we? But yeah, I just very briefly, do you sort of see this again as another moment of literacies that there's been things in the past about media literacies, and is that the kind of, would that be one way of understanding this now?
Yeah, very much. On the how much do you need me? I think some of these things I would love to see come out as a toolkit or a playbook or as things that other people can pick up and build on. That was the idea behind the cards, that we can make them and they're autonomous. We don't need to do them. The literacies, it's gotten to the point where the hard technical literacies about what things are doing only work in some ways. I hear people talking about vibe checks for the language models. They run them on the benchmarks, but then they have to do a vibe check to see how it's playing out in life. And so it's this kind of relational literacy around technology that I think is going to be really important.
Well, look, Dave, I think I'm going to have to bring it to an end. I do get the feeling, and thank you actually for putting all of these references in the chat as well. This has been great. And for everyone who's been with us today, and I know we've been gradually whittling down because people have obviously got to go on to do other things. But I think it's really clear from the way people have been writing in the chat, there's a lot of enthusiasm for what you presented, and you bring so much enthusiasm to this. So deeply, deeply grateful. And I'd really love to kind of have part 2 of this at some point, because I think and maybe we could think about a different modality of how we present for this as well, to allow further to unpack all of this even more, which would be fantastic, because you've really set the scene here beautifully. So I just want to say on behalf of everyone today, and certainly for the organisers of the group, again, a massive thank you for helping us kickstart again the webinar series, and for providing us with a really thought-provoking and really engaging, very tangible way of thinking about all of this. So massive, massive thank you to you. And I hope we can sort of continue this conversation in some way over the coming months, year, however, whatever temporality we can work on.
Yeah, thank
Thank
you so
you.
much for inviting me. I hope we get to play more in the future. And the Turing Institute is just at the end of the Eurostar.
Absolutely. So yes,
it's quicker for me to get there than it was when I lived in Edinburgh,
yeah,
believe it or
that's
not.
true. Yes, absolutely. That's very, very true.
So
So yes,
I'd be very interested to come and play.
well, I think that would be a really good. There might be a really good opportunity there then for us to think about something in person, and I'm sure many people who have attended today would be very keen to engage in different ways with yourself and various of your collaborators and so forth. So that would be really exciting. Gosh, okay. Well, I'm sorry if I haven't picked up on everyone's comments. I've tried to pick up on through the chat. I know these environments are not always the best, but I think we've had a real tonic there, and I look forward to sort of more interactions over with different events that we have coming up. Thank you so much, Dave. If you want to hang on just for a moment afterwards, I can maybe just check with you a couple of things about maybe getting the talk onto the web and everything. But for everyone, thank you very much for attending. And please do look out for forthcoming events. There is the event on the 10th of May. Yes, yeah, we're moving into May, aren't we? Yeah. Which would mean doing a little bit of reading. There's the article to read prior to the session, ideally. You don't have to read it, but the idea is that we read the paper and come together. So I will put out some further messaging on that. Please do look out, and obviously feel free to get in touch at any time. But thank you very much for attending today.